Okay, let's get started. 10:30. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who were not here last week, this is Corporate Financial Analysis. My name is Leo. You got all the other details in the outline. Not going to go through that again. So today's lecture is on top-down analysis, basically industry analysis. The reason for showing this short video was because we had a little bit of time to kill, and also because I do that for a living, and the reason why I started doing that was because of top-down analysis like the one we're going to be going through today. So that is an actual sport. It's called foot golf. You play with a soccer ball in a golf course. The really interesting thing about that is that in a country like Australia, Australia is the 5th country in the world with the largest number of golf courses per 1,000 inhabitants, right? So, and when you look at the golf industry, memberships, how many of you play golf? 1, 2, where do you play at? Gordon, all right. So and you're a club member, or you play social? No. Okay. So out of, say, 100 people we have sitting here, we have one person. How many of you hit a golf ball in your life? Okay. I could never hit it. I always miss. But say there's 10 of you who hit a ball. How many of you kicked a soccer ball in your life? Yeah, a bit more. How many of you think that you could potentially be good at kicking a soccer ball compared to a golf ball? I think it's a lot easier to play that, right? So one of the reasons behind getting into that sport is lots of golf courses, golf membership going down, social players dropping year on year, and at the same time, soccer, football, at this present time, is the #1 club sport in Australia. So even in a country like Australia, where rugby and Aussie rules are very strong, already registration at the club level, soccer is the #1 sport. So basically, putting those two things together, having lots of golf courses with lots of unutilized tee times, and having a growing population of soccer players plus social players, corporate, this is a sport that is great for corporate groups. So we have lots of big companies coming to do their Christmas parties, right? Because you can do this, have a few drinks, and have fun while you celebrate the end of the year. I won't bore you with my passion for this, but I thought it was like a good introduction to top-down analysis. What is it that we do when we do top-down analysis? As I said last week, this first page in each of our lectures is telling you what are the main things you're supposed to learn this week. So this is what you're going to use to study for your final exam. So if you can answer those questions and you feel confident about knowing the information behind those points, you should be good with the content for the week. So what we are supposed to do today is understand how we can provide an overview of an industry, its economic characteristics, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities to develop new businesses, or opportunities to invest in existing businesses in the industry. So our do list says we have to link economic characteristics of an industry and a firm's strategies. So what we will see and discuss is industries have different characteristics and you can make money in different ways. We will see throughout the subject that you can basically do money turning over or getting a margin, right? So those are the two main things. How much can I sell? And what is the profit that I get for each transaction I make. In some industries, it's a lot easier to make a lot of turnover with very low margins, and there's other industries where turnover is not so high, but you have higher margins, right? So understanding how you make money in an industry is key to succeeding in that industry. So we will look at financial statements. We will do an overview of that and measures of profitability. We won't stop there for too long because that is what we will be doing next week. So we will have an overview of creating common-size financial statements. That is a really quick way of understanding the economics of an industry. So at the firm level, you can compare across firms and see what makes a winning firm in this industry. We will follow on to looking at 3 tools to study the economic characteristics of an industry, making special focus on Porter's 5 forces. So this is the lecture of the week that when you're studying for the final, you refer to, well, this is the 5 forces, Porter's 5 forces. And this is exactly what you're doing for your first part of the assignment. So things we will be discussing here today are the main things you're going to be discussing for your first part of the assignment. And we will also look at sources to get financial information for publicly traded firms. So what is it that financial analysts or security analysts do? Basically look at financial statements of firms, predict what the performance, so we study historical performance, predict what future performance may look like, value the firm, and then make a decision on whether you should buy, hold, or sell the shares. That is basically all we're doing throughout this term. The main focus of this is understanding the financial statements, making good assessments of current performance, forecasting, and valuing the firm. But before we get into analyzing a firm, we need to sort of pick which firms we want to look into, right? And that will largely depend on, we don't want to look for firms that are not going to make us money, right? So before getting to analyze a firm, you have to find industries and sectors within industries that are attractive, okay? And that is what this lecture is all about. So out of those 5 steps, identifying economic characteristics, identify strategies at the firm level within the industry, those 2 steps we will cover today. Quality of financial statements we will revisit in week 9. Profitability and risk we will cover in week 11. And valuing the firm is going to be weeks 6 to 8. And between now and week 6, we are working on the building blocks to do that valuation. Okay, so today we will look at industry. Next week we will do historical analysis. The following one we will do forecasting, and then cash flows, and then valuation. So those are all the steps we're taking towards doing the whole process. So let's start with looking at the economic characteristics of the firm. So one way to, this is going a step ahead. I would say before doing this, you would have an idea of which industry sectors you're interested in investing in. Once you've come down to that level, what you will do is you would get a number of firms in that industry, and you can compare them using common-sized financial statements. So why would you use this as a tool? What you see when you get into firms within the same industry is that there's different sizes, right? So when you look at the financial statements of different companies, it's very hard to compare who's doing better, who's doing worse, who could do better, who did better in the past and is not doing so well nowadays. So by using common size financial statements, we turn absolute numbers in financial statements into relative numbers, right? So instead of looking at admin expenses as a value in millions of dollars, we look at admin expenses as a percentage of revenue. So once you've done that, once you have your admin expenses per dollar of revenue, you can easily compare across firms, right? Because if you have a firm that is 10 times higher than, larger than another firm, and you look at admin expenses for the two firms, that's not going to tell you anything. However, if you say this firm is spending 12% of revenues in admin expenses, and another firm is spending 5%, you have a first hypothesis there, which is the second firm is a little bit more efficient in managing admin, right? But then you may as well dig a little bit deeper and see, well, maybe if, so what would be other reasons why firm B could have a 5% compared to firm A having a 12%? What other characteristics of firms could be playing a role there? Size? Would you expect a larger firm to be more efficient than a smaller firm? Because they can share services across, say, different units? That could be a reason why a larger firm will have a smaller percentage of admin expenses. So let's look at a quick overview of a balance sheet. Left-hand side, we have our assets, basically non-current and current. Current assets, we're listing a few there: cash, accounts receivable, inventory. In some cases, in some financial statements, that cash line, you will have it broken down into two. One could be merely cash, and another one could be short-term investments. Right? These are deposits that the company is making with excess cash. As a rule of thumb, if you have only a cash line for a company, and that cash line is more than 2% of annual revenues, I would tend to say anything in excess of 2% is excess cash. This may change across industries. And the reason why I'm making that distinction is because when we look at cash flows, we will only want to focus on those cash flows that are used in the operations of the firm. Right? If a firm is sitting on a pile of cash that they're not using, right, that cash is not relevant for our analysis. It will be in the sense that we will recommend doing something different with that cash, either paying more dividends or using it elsewhere, repaying debt, or many other options. But we won't use that cash for our valuations. When we look at non-current assets, we basically do the distinction between tangible and intangible. You know, tangibles, we have lands and buildings. We usually call that PPE, property, plant, and equipment. And then we will have our intangibles. That could be trademarks, goodwill. And we know that these assets, how do they relate to the income statement? Via what? Depreciation and amortization, right? So there's a depreciation for tangible assets and an amortization for intangible assets. So when we look at our income statement, those guys are going to be linked to these values here, right? And that depends on the life of the assets, the average life of the assets, if you're doing a straight line or any other depreciation method that you may want to use. We'll come back to that. The right hand of the balance sheet is what the firm owes. To whom? Basically, shareholders and debt holders, but also the state, because there's taxes in there. Sometimes employees, right, because there's salaries to be paid there, and suppliers. Okay? When we look at those 5 sources that I just mentioned, equity holders, debt holders, the state, suppliers, and employees, the last 3 are related to operations. Okay? Taxes I have to pay if I'm operating as a business. Salaries I have to pay, and suppliers I have to pay. Those 3 are related to operations. Equity holders and debt holders are owners of pieces of the business, and they are investors in the business. The reason why we want to make this distinction very clear from day 2 is because who has used weighted average cost of capital before, WACC? Okay, for a bit of you. So when we are thinking about weighted average cost of capital, we are thinking about how much it costs a firm to get financing per dollar of capital invested in the firm, right? Who are the 2 sources of that capital? Debt holders and equity holders, okay? So when we look at the balance sheet as we are going to use it, we will rearrange it so that on the right-hand side, we only have financial liabilities and equity. We will come back to that, don't worry. I thought it would be good to flag it today. Income statement. Starting from the top line, sales and revenue, or revenue, going through potentially other income, COGS, admin expenses, general expenses, marketing expenses, and so on and so forth, other expenses, and I would add to that line depreciation and amortization. That gets us, when we sum all those numbers, we get our earnings before interest and taxes, which is an operating profit or loss. After that, we subtract any interest expenses and add back any interest income to get to, and you won't see it there, what's usually known as EBT, earnings before taxes. After that, we pay taxes, income taxes, and we get to net income or the profit or loss for the quarter or the year. So we will be working with balance sheets and income statements in doing a few things. To start off, common size financial statements. So I said we use common size financial statements to be able to compare across firms using relative measures. Those relative measures could be taken in 2 different ways. The first one is dividing every item in the balance sheet by revenue. I just want to see which one was first. Okay, so we get the top line of the income statement here, and we divide each of these items by revenue. What that will give us is, it'll give us an idea of what is the percentage of cash held by the company per dollar of revenue throughout the year. Okay, what's the percentage of inventory held by the company per dollar of sales? And so on and so forth. We will do the same thing with the income statement. So one of the things that we have there is no limit to the percentage of in the balance sheet, because we can have a company that has 200 million in assets and they only sell 50 million a year, in which case the ratio would be what? What did I say? The company has 200 in assets and sell 50%. So they have assets that are 4 times the revenue of the year. Okay, so there's no limit to how high those ratios can be. Let's move to the income statement. When we divide each of the items in the income statement by revenue, we are certain that we will have 100% in the top line. Because basically what we're doing is we're dividing this number divided the same number, so that's going to be 100%. And then you will get a ratio of each of these items to the top line. So next week in the tutorial, we will do this in a spreadsheet, and we will use it to analyze and compare companies. And it's going to become a lot more real. So one way of doing it, you divide every item in the balance sheet and the income statement by total revenue. An alternative, this is usually called the, This is usually called the American way of doing common size financial statements. An alternative, which we call in this subject an Australian way of doing it, we divide all the items in the balance sheet by total assets, and we divide items in the income statement by total revenue. So what this guarantees is that we will have 100% in both statements, right? Because in the balance sheet, we're going to be dividing one of the items, which is total assets by itself, getting 100%. And in the income statement, we're going to be dividing revenue by itself, another 100%. I am much more comfortable using the first method, dividing everything by revenue, but it's entirely up to you which one you want to use. These are relatives, so no matter which method you use, the answers you will get from this analysis will be the same regardless of whether you use the American method or the Australian one. Okay? And we will prove that in the tutorials with a spreadsheet. So you can do that before next Friday. Otherwise, we'll do it in the tutorials. Yeah, so this is what we're doing next week in the tutorial. What are the sort of things that we see when we use common size financial statements? Well, some patterns will emerge in different industries. And those patterns will have to do with how you make money in that industry. Is it through turnover with low margins, or is it through high margins with lower turnover? So here there's a couple of examples of, first, a grocery store chain where, and let me know if you agree with this, you would expect to have high cost of goods sold, low profit margins, and profit being driven by turnover. Does anyone not agree with that? Or let me ask you a different question. Is this true for all grocery store chains? If you think about the biggest grocery store chains that we can think of, Coles, Woolworths, you'd expect these guys to have very high turnover, right? So most of the profit is driven by selling many times the value in assets, right? That doesn't mean that they don't get good margins, but they definitely are not a margins business. They're a turnover business. Whereas you may have some other store chains that are not necessarily groceries, or if you go to the organic market, right? Organics, you would expect that to be a little bit less about turnover and a little bit more about profit, right? Because the production of the things these guys sell, they're not as available to have high turnover, but they definitely charge a premium for organic products. So when you're moving from mass store, grocery store retails, chains, to organic or niche store chains, you're moving from super high turnover and moderate margins to smaller turnover and higher margins. The reason why I'm mentioning this here is because looking at the one industry, when you look at different sectors within that industry, the way you make money is completely different, right? Huge store chains are much more about how efficient they can be in making us buy as many things as possible. Organics would be much more about getting you exactly what you want and pricing it correctly so that you cover their margins. Moving to pharmaceutical companies, this is a very dramatic change from grocery store chains to pharmaceuticals. What's the difference between the two industries? Well, pharmaceuticals will tend to be lower turnover, will have very high profit margins. Question, will pharmaceuticals always have really high profit margins? Don't be shy. Or is there a period while they can have high profit margins and then those margins drop? Anyone working in the pharmaceutical industry? No? Anyone taking legal drugs? No? So how do you incentivize the research and development in the pharmaceutical industry? Any ideas? So the state does that through two avenues. One is generating basic research at universities that eventually shifts to pharmaceuticals. That is most of the time state funded. And the other way in which development in the pharmaceutical industry is incentivized is by awarding companies patents for new discoveries, right? How does a patent work? So the way, you're very shy. I'll just give you a breather. How do patents work? Yeah? Yeah? Well, yeah, that's a very good point. Before going anywhere, suppose everyone follows the rules. If you have a patent, what that gives you is the exclusive right to sell that product or service while that patent is in place, right? And that would be 10 years. So what you're saying is, I acknowledge you've invested a lot of money and that many of your research programs have failed, because in order to get one success, you're probably working on 50 different things. So what we're doing is we are giving you a benefit that when you successfully bring a drug in the market, you will be the exclusive one to sell it for 10 years, right? So that gives an artificial monopoly to that particular company, right? So they can basically price the item at whatever price they want, because you cannot turn around and go and get it cheaper from somewhere else. What happens as the patent comes to an end is that then anyone else can go and look at that patent, replicate the medicine that you created, rebrand it, and sell it, right? And you can get other big labs doing that, but you can also get like very small or generic, non-branded alternatives that bring the price down. So what you will find is that pharmaceutical companies have very high margins throughout the life of a patent, and then that drops when more competitors come in the market. So we had an overview of the balance sheet, profit and loss statement, and common size financial statements. Let's look at these three ways of looking at the economic characteristics of an industry. So number one is value chain analysis, then we will look at Porter's 5 forces, and finally economic attributes. Before we start doing this, just get in the back burner the auto industry, car makers industry, right? That is an industry that I find very interesting to discuss while we're doing this, because when you compare it to other industries, the impact of technology in the last 50 years is not nearly as much as what we've seen in many other industries, right? And that is basically related to the way cars are moved, right? And what sort of energy sources we've been using for cars, what's the economics around that industry, and what are the alternative industries. So while we go through this analysis, just think about Tesla. Everyone is aware of what Tesla does? Yeah? No? Can someone share that with us? They do cars, right? So they're a new entrant in the car industry. They never built cars before until the 2000s, right? So they're a new entrant to an existing industry that has been selling cars for 200 years. So we'll go back to that in a minute. So first framework to analyze an industry is to look at the value chain. When we're looking at the value chain and this is an example of the pharmaceutical industry, is looking at how things are done, right? And so here you're going from 1 to 5, from research and discovery of drugs, to getting approvals, to manufacturing, to creating a demand, to distributing and selling the drug, right? So that is, in summary, what pharmaceuticals do every time they have a new drug. Do they do this with all drugs? Not really, because what happens with many of their lines of research is that they never leave stage 1. Right? So in many lines, they work for years. They never get anything that cures what they're trying to cure, so they just drop it. Many of them get to stage 2, and then it takes 7 years to get approval to sell the drug. Okay? So what you see is, if you were interested in investing in firms in the pharmaceutical industry, you have a few options here, because not all firms do all these 5 steps. You have many firms that rarely do any research and development, and what they're doing is they're sitting on 4 or 5, just waiting for patents to drop, and they're really good at replicating existing drugs and making them very affordable, right? So the question when you're analyzing the pharmaceutical industry is, do you rather invest in the big pharmaceutical companies that spend millions and millions of dollars in research and development and take huge risks? Or do you rather focus on companies that only work on proven drugs and make them very efficiently. Okay? So when we look at the value chain analysis, this is something both firms look at to design their strategies, where do we want to focus, but also you as an analyst wanting to invest in firms can also make that decision on companies in which stage of the value chain you want to focus on. Porter's 5 forces. That is the main thing you're going to remember from this lecture, other than the foot golf, hopefully. And I'm sure you all had some sort of exposure to this in the past. So the 5 forces, you have them there. The number one in importance there is intensity of rivalry. One thing that I noticed when I read the first part of the assignment is that sometimes the order in which you talk about these things is a little bit odd. I would definitely start with internal rivalry or the intensity of rivalry, right? Because that is at the core of the industry. What you look at in there is who are the main players in this industry? How is it that they make money? And why is it that some other firms don't do as well as others, right? So that's what you answer when you look at the internal rivalry. Common size financial statements is the kind of analysis you do when you're doing this, because you're looking at top 10 firms in the industry and looking at who's doing well and who's doing not so well. Let's go and explain those 5 forces into axes. We can look at the industry at a horizontal level and at a vertical level. When we're looking at horizontal competition, the three parts of the 5 forces that we include are internal rivalry, threats of new entrants, and threat of substitutes. Okay? So that is, these are all sitting at the same level because they are either manufacturing or producing the same type of services or very similar ones. And the only way you can grow horizontally is by being more efficient than your competitors. Whereas buyer's power and supplier's power, we're looking at the industry at different levels. So we're looking at the value chain, and we're looking at where is the industry sourcing the supplies from, and who they're buying to. And this idea of vertical competition is closely linked to the idea of vertical integration, right? One of the things I mentioned when we looked at value chain analysis is you can select firms at different levels of the value chain, right? And firms let's sit in 3. Firms can either move vertically higher up in the value chain, or they can move lower down in the value chain, right? The more you go higher up, the more control you have over the supplies. The more you move lower down, the more control you have over your buyers. And you are sitting where the higher margins are. So there's a direct relationship between what we look at when we analyze value chain and this vertical competition. Vertical integration is very, very common in many industries, where big players at some levels see that there's higher margins at other levels, and they either integrate vertically upwards or downwards. Many times they do that by acquisitions. So starting with force number one, rivalry amongst existing firms. First thing you need to describe when you look at an industry is how concentrated competition is. Is this an industry that is basically a 5 or 6 company kind of industry where only a few rivals take control of most of the supply in this industry? Or is it a very diffused rivalry where you have thousands and thousands of competitors? That is key in understanding how you make money or how you invest in an industry. For instance, a long time ago, most pharmacies would be owned by individual people, right? So that would be a very diffuse rivalry. So the kind of incentives those sort of industries create is for someone with enough capital to go and say, okay, so we have a couple thousand pharmacies selling throughout Sydney and Melbourne. How about we get a store chain that does this, either by buying out these existing players or by competing directly with them, right? So if you have a very diffuse rivalry, there's great incentives to create economies of scale by concentrating the supply. And that is what you see with the Chemist Warehouse, the Pricelines, and so on and so forth, right? You have much more buying power, you have a lot more coverage not only on retail stores but also online. And that makes you more efficient and getting more turnover at the same time. So what we would expect is that when we have more concentration, there's lower competition and firms are more profitable. And the opposite when you have diffuse rivalry. We will discuss in the tutorial farms. When you sell a commodity and you are one of thousands of producers producing that, your power with your buyers is very low, right? And just think about farmers and dairy farmers as an example. They end up receiving whatever price supermarket chains want to pay them, right? And they only depend on Coles and Woolies saying, oh, okay, so we're going to start selling milk a little bit more expensive to pass that on to farmers, right? But it's something that is completely out of their control because they're small and they don't have enough power to negotiate with their buyers. So when we're looking at the concentration level of an industry, this is a ratio, HHI, that can be used to measure the level of concentration. And this is used mostly to determine whether, especially in times of mergers and acquisitions, whether a merger or an acquisition could be potentially challenged by regulators. Why would a merger or acquisition be challenged? Well, because in order to have a reasonable level of competition, regulators sometimes may get in an industry and say, look, this is too concentrated, this is almost a monopoly, so you can potentially charge whatever price you want and lower the quality as much as you want because there's no competition, okay? So in order to keep a fair amount of competition, there's restrictions to how much companies can get together. So when you measure this, you're basically looking at the market share of each of the companies, and you measure this index twice. You measure it before the proposed merger and after the proposed merger, right? So there's two pictures that you're getting at there, and so there's two measurements you can take. So you can look at the overall index, the value, absolute value of the index, and you can also look at how much it changes between before the merger and after the merger. And the table at the bottom of this page tells you when government action is likely, okay? And government action is likely if the ratio sits between 1,000 and 1,800, and the change is 100 points or more. We will do calculations of this in the tutorial, so don't worry about it. Another potential challenge happens if the level of the index is 1,800 or above, even if the change is slightly lower, so 50 or more. So this is a quick calculation that allows you to determine whether government action is likely or not. Very quickly go through an example. 10 firms in an industry. The top 2 firms, they own 20% each, and then you have 8 firms that own 7.5% of the market share. The question is, if the top 2 firms decide to merge, whether there will be challenge or not. So what we're doing here is calculating the pre-merger index, 1250, the post-merger index, which is 2050. Clearly, that is over 1,800. So we can say that it's very likely that there's going to be a challenge, especially because the change in the index between pre and post is 800, which is higher than 50. So if I go back to the table before, just retain 2 numbers, 2050 and 800. What is the post-merger index? It is more than 1,800, yes. Was the change higher than 50? Yes. So there's definitely going to be a challenge to that merger. Next week in the tutorial, you will have a similar exercise to calculate this. I strongly suggest you calculate this before and use the tutorial to make sure that you got it right. Okay. Who's going to be the winner of the first Tim Tams of the term? So today I got originals and dark chocolate. The first winner will get to choose which one he or she wants. Please remember to use your student ID. So basically, if you don't have a believable student ID, you don't get the Tim Tams if you win. So too bad for you. There's more than 70 people here. All right, 5 seconds. Yeah, so we discussed that some retail stores may have low inventory turnover. We mentioned luxury and organic. Right. All right, we got 5 clear contenders for the first team chance. Yeah, so the higher the index, the more concentrated you are. That was the example of getting 2050 over the 1800. So who's the first winner? All right. So you're going with dark or original? Original? Well done, mate. Okay, continuing on with 5 forces. Threat of new entrants. Threat of new entrants is closely related to barriers of entry, and this is something you will definitely have to discuss in your first part of the assignment. The higher the barriers of entry, the less likely it is to have new entrants. What kind of entry barriers do we know? Well, capital can be an entry barrier. It could be knowledge, it could be patents, it could be, what else? Customer loyalty could also be a barrier to entry. The reason why I mentioned Tesla before is because Tesla is a new entrant in a market with a very particular distinctive characteristic, which is what? What is different to Tesla compared to any other car maker in the world, other than the CEO smoking pot in public? Yeah, they're all electric cars. So the way they power their cars is completely different to any other car maker in the industry. There's another difference because manufacturers such as Toyota have been doing some sort of hybrid for a long time. So the way in which Tesla approached the problem of how we use an alternative energy in the car industry was completely different. Toyota was going with, what is the main model in Toyota using some sort of hybrid? Camry. Yeah, Camry, and originally it was the Prius, right? So it was like a mid-market kind of car. What Tesla did is they went very high-end, right? So what they're saying is, we know that if we start at the mid-market, we're not going to get the traction to develop the technology to the next level. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a car that people would love to drive, right? And people with money are going to be willing to pay for it. And that's going to be paying for the development of the new technology. So instead of starting mass, they started high-end with the hope that that technology costs will come down and they will go from top to mass, right? So it's a completely different approach to an industry. Why did we need a Tesla to get, because what happened after Tesla broke in the market is you see more and more brands saying we're working in electric cars and so on and so forth. Why did we need a Tesla to come and break into the market in order to get more development in that area? What do you think? Are there any other industries related to the car industry and the way cars are moved that will give you an incentive to not change the energy? Petrol. So you have a huge industry developing fossil fuels, right, that have an incentive for cars to never go electric, right? So you had a cheap source of energy with a huge lobby power that was preventing the development of new technologies in a particular industry. And only when you had this new entrant, which was a guy who came with a lot of money from other businesses that he did before, that could break into the industry doing something radically different. So it took a lot of investment and genius to go past the entry barriers in the car industry, right? Because car industry, you would have loyal customers, you would have people that would only buy Holden or Ford or whatever brand. You had huge lobbies and governments not making it easy for you to develop new technologies. And you had a technology that was a lot more expensive to develop than the existing one. So all those things were preventing new entrants in the car manufacturing industry. And Tesla managed to get a sneak peek of what the future of the car industry may be. So when we looked at entry barriers, we discussed patents, brand names, high capital requirements, regulatory restrictions such as in the banking and broadcasting industries where in the broadcasting industry, you can only have so many licenses, or if you're in press, you cannot do TV, or if you do radio, you cannot do some other thing, and so on and so forth. And also learning curve effects, know-how that accumulates over time, and that makes it harder for new entrants to get in the industry. So we looked at internal rivalry and new entrants. How about the threat of substitutes? This is key for you to understand, especially again in the assignment, not to get the threat of new entrants and the threat of substitutes mixed up. Threat of substitute is, this is not a new player in the market. This is a product or service that is similar to the one the industry offers, and that could potentially drag some customers away from the industry, right? This is not new entrants in the existing industries, competitive industries that are different, but that could potentially provide substitute products or services. So one very important thing in the threat of substitutes is how costly it is to switch, right? So if your main source of moving cars is petrol, how expensive it is for car makers and for car owners to, instead of using fossil fuels, using renewable sources of energy, right? So that is, the higher those costs are, the less likely people are going to switch to substitutes. And the main reason why it's taking so long to change the energy matrix in all over the world is because switching costs are very high, right? And we've seen that in South Australia last year, when depending mostly on renewable resources sometimes can be very costly if you are unlucky enough to have no wind, no rain, and very little sun for a long period of time. So switching costs are key to preventing customers from switching to other substitutes. So definitely, the more unique the product you offer, the less likely it is that there will be a threat of substitutes. The industry you will be analyzing, you will find lots of possible substitutes, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Buyer's power. So we look at the three horizontal ones: internal rivalry, threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes. Now we go to the verticals. People who buy from us. It is key to analyze how strong their bargaining power is, right? Because the more power our buyers have, the less likely it is that we will be profitable, right? Because strong buyers will have the power to buy whenever they want from us, as much as they want, and to try and force prices down, right? So buyer power is inversely related to profitability. The higher the buyer power, the less profitability firms in the industry will have. The lower the buyer power, the more likely it is that you will have high profitability. Just going to the last line in this slide. Are the buyers price takers or price setters? So if buyers can determine what the price is, supermarkets determining what the price of milk is, gives dairy farmers a very, very bad P&L, because their top line, how much they are getting for their milk, depends on what the buyer is determining the price should be. If the buyers are price takers, people who buy iPhones, and you basically go and buy the iPhone for whatever price is on offer, that gives a lot more power to the industry and to players in that industry, okay? So, and what we will see is that this buyer power largely depends on, remember when we looked at level of concentration? If your buyer industry is very concentrated, players in that industry will have a lot of power over you. If you're selling to individuals, they will be very diffuse. they won't have any or very little chances to get together and get a better bargaining position, so you're in a much better position selling to very scattered industries or to individuals other than to very concentrated industries. So the last of the 5 forces is suppliers' power. Suppliers are those whom firms in the industry buy services and products from. And similar to the relationship with buyers, the power these suppliers have will largely depend on how concentrated the industry is. And the other thing that is relevant for suppliers is how important the supply they're providing you as a firm is in your overall cost structure. So if this is a supplier that is supplying you with something that is 70% of your cost structure, they will have more power over you than if your supplier we're talking about is who does the cleaning for your offices, right? So if someone is providing you a cleaning service and they decide to double the price, you can just say, that's enough, I'm going to call someone else, and you have no power over me. However, if this supplier is providing you with a key component in your value chain, and something that accounts for 70 or 80% of your cost structure, if you stop buying from them, it's less likely that you're going to be able to find another supplier quickly and with enough capacity to provide you the amount of goods or services you need. So supplier power will both depend on how concentrated the industry is, how large your supplier is, and how large the supply is compared to the overall supply you're getting for your business. So we've gone through 5 forces: external rivalry, threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes, power of buyers and suppliers. On top of that, there's many other influences. Changes in technologies, changes in how regulation affects the business, changes in how people live, and also demographic changes. So all these things are forces that are outside of the industry, but that they definitely have an impact on how you do business. Let's look at a few of these influences. So invention of the microchip and the impact it had in many industries, moving from more mechanical work to more digital kind of work, automation. So those are all changes that happened because of some particular technology changes that affected many industries. Demographic influences, the baby boomers. So large group of population that are not only a big cohort of people around the world, but it's also the longest living or the highest life expectancy group in the history of humanity, and what sort of impacts that has in social security, in the health industry, in housing, and so on and so forth. So that is something that is not triggered by nothing else that human evolution and particular events in the history of humanity. But as those people remain in the planet and age, there's lots of risks and lots of opportunities for businesses to do things for these guys. We're getting to the point in which we have to take care of them, and that's a big industry nowadays. Government influences, changes in regulation, changes in tax policies, things that are completely outside of the control of firms, but definitely have an impact on them. Finally, social influences. Changes in the workforce, women working more hours, working towards getting a more egalitarian pay, and so on and so forth. Changes in tobacco consumption, what sort of impacts that has not only in the tobacco industry but also in the health industry. We can skip that one. And then on top of all of that, you have macroeconomic influences. So we're moving up. So we're going from the very place where firms compete against each other to all the side influences, to influences from macroeconomic factors such as economic growth, inflation, availability of credit and cost of credit in interest rates. All of these things will have an impact on how profitable and how healthy industries remain. If you have a macroeconomic context with high inflation, high interest rates, low access to credit, and low economic growth, that will have an impact on internal rivalry, because you're going to have an economy in recession, and instead of seeing how much we can grow our market share, we're going to be analyzing which firms are keeping their market share as the market shrinks, right? Quite the opposite, if you have low inflation, lots of credit at very low rates, fueling huge growth. So the way you look at industries, the industries that become interesting to invest in are completely different depending on these macroeconomic conditions. So this slide is definitely the one I would be looking at when working for the first assignment. So if we go from the center to the edges, we have the 5 forces within that rectangle. So we have internal rivalry, we have new entrants, we have substitutes, bargaining power of customers and suppliers. But then on top of that, you have government, social, technological, and demographic influences, and on top of that, macroeconomic influences. So this is the framework to do your first assignment, and I would strongly suggest to touch on all these points, right? And to make sure you discuss how each of these forces is having an impact in the industry you're analyzing. The economics attribute framework is a slightly different framework, based more on demand and supply and how you do business. I'm not going to stop too much on this one, conscious of time, because I want to give away the second batch of Tim Tams. Okay, 5 seconds. You're not going to get any. You're not going to get any. So glad you're not going to get any. I hope you win, whoever that is. Yeah, the higher the barriers of entry, less likely to have new entrants, more power to have greater pricing. Be careful. So high capital requirements are a barrier to entry. This one's tricky. So baby boomers smoking less, we would say that is what type of influence. There's a social influence, not a demographic, right? Because there's a decision behind that. So baby boomers retiring is something that just happens because they're aging. So that's a government influence, not a microeconomic, right? There's a government decision to change taxes, okay? All right. Last question. Who's that? All right, you only have dark chocolate. I'll give that to you in a minute. Yeah. I'll just keep them for myself, to myself. Just very quickly before we go, it's only a minute. So when we look at industry analysis, we not only have to look at what the situation of the industry and the context is, but also we need to look into what are the strategies of firms within the industry. So the additional thing that you will have to do for your first assignment is make sure you identify how firms make money in this industry. Do they do it via cost leadership, right? Or do they do it which turns into higher turnover? Or do they do it through product differentiation? That would be the Apple case or the iPhone case. So having said that, I will see you next Friday. Thank you very much. Hello.
How are you?
Good.
Always good. Especially when you're on the gun side. Today I am so flat in my And I'm doing 12 to 2 here and then 3 to 6 here.
All right. No, I got a break and then I got two tutorials until 4:30. So
Crazy. Friday's so busy.
yeah.
Isn't Friday supposed to be quiet days?
Not anymore. Not this term for me.
Not this term for me either.
Enjoy.
Thanks. Good morning. I've done all the emails I have. Yeah, we'll need to look at it. I do have like 90.
First class supplies would be enrolled in it.
I do have about 93 emails that are still unattended, but I've looked at all the Globus one and attended them. So I don't know whether you to be. Isn't that what you're talking about? The UTS Online Globus?
I can't email you from Globus. I can email you from my UTS Online. I mean my UTS program.
Sorry, we must be. I have no idea what you're talking about. What I'm trying to say is all the emails I have that asked to be removed from the UTS Online group, I have attended to. So if yours hasn't been attended to, it means that I don't have it.
All right.
So my